So the Torah consists of the 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The Nevi'im consists of both historical books, like Judges, Kings, Samuel, Kings, what happened when they entered the land, and also all the prophets. The 3 major prophets, called major because they have big books. That's why they're major. That's Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, and then the Trias, which are the 12 minor prophets. Those are all the prophets, but smaller books. And then you get to the Ketuvim, the writings, and that's everything else. Psalms, Proverbs, Daniel, Esther, all the Megillot, all of that is in Job, books that are unclassifiable, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which we read on Sukkot, we just read on Sukkot. That's all in the Ketuvim. And all of that in the rabbi's reading of the books, and we'll talk about the rabbis in a second, it's all one. So a verse that is written in Torah could be commenting on a verse that was written in Kohelet, even though Kohelet was written close to 1,000 years later. It doesn't matter, it's all one continuous conversation, everything comments on everything else. And that's why when you do Torah interpretation from the rabbis, you gotta have all the books. If you want to see how they comment. And when I say comment, it doesn't necessarily, bless you, even mean that they're part of the same subject. It can just be because they used the same word. And if you use a word in one place, then if you have all of the Tanakh running in your head, it reminds you of the time it's used in another place. Obviously, if you use the same word, it must mean that there in some way or another is supposed to be a connection. Most of our time is going to be obviously spent on the 5 books. And are we up and running? Yeah. Okay, good. So those of you who are watching can now notice. Most of our time is going to be spent on the 5 books. We have class today, although we're going to be short today for reasons I explained before the class. And next week, and then for the following 2 weeks, we won't have class, but that's because I'll be in Israel. So that's the best excuse not to have class. But we will this week and next week, which means we'll have to cover a lot of ground, which is what I intend to do to sort of bring you up to speed on this and on Torah study in general. This is the way we do it here. The book of Bereshit, the first book, is in character different from all the other books because it's not about the grand narrative of the Torah. The grand narrative of the Torah is slavery and wandering in the desert. That's what the other 4 books are all about. And what you have in Bereshit are characters who don't recur, like Adam and Eve. Nobody talks about them in the other 4 books, right? And Cain and Abel, nobody talks about them in the other 4 books. Even Noah, nobody talks about in the other 4 books. Because part of the wonder of the Jewish tradition is that we don't start with the Jewish tradition. That is, the Jewish New Year doesn't start with the journey of Abraham. The Christian New Year, by the way, starts with the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Muslim New Year with the journey of Muhammad. The Jewish New Year with the creation of the world. And so Torah is about the creation of the world, not the creation of the Jewish people. And that's because the Torah is about the story of God, who creates everything, not just Jews, right? Adam and Eve aren't Jewish. Right, so if they were Jewish, they would have said, Eve is lovely, we'll stay here. Thank you very much. A few throw pillows, and it'll be. No, because Adam and Eve and Noah, none of these people are Jewish, and that's incredibly important to Jewish theology, because, as we will see, Noah ends up saving the world, which means that there is righteousness, goodness, merit, not outside of the Jewish tradition, which is why later on the rabbis say, the righteous of all nations have a place in the world. Right? It's not as though righteousness is a special preserve of the Jews, it's a special preserve of righteous human beings. And that's illustrated by this, and also the fact that God creates one human being, who, as we will discover through the 2, is one of the 2, that is Adam sort of gets split into male and female, but starts off as one to tell you that every human being is an entire world, because Adam eventually becomes an entire world, right? So those sorts of universalistic messages begin the book, and then later on, obviously with Abraham, the book gets to be the narrative of a particular people, but we haven't gotten there yet. That's in Lech Lecha, which is the third parsha, and today we're going to do the first two. We're going to do the first two because last week was Bereshit, and we hadn't started yet, and this week we do Noah. So we generally do parsha by parsha, although we're not so OCD about it. Sometimes we skip around, but generally we do parsha by parsha, and so this week we're going to do Bereshit and Noah together in a short time. So we're not going to go through the entire story. I just want to make several points about it and then open it up for a couple of questions before we have to wrap up. The most important statement in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is translated different ways, but we don't have to concern ourselves with that now, is that the Torah assumes God. Never introduces God, never argues for God. It's just in the beginning, God. And remember, if you're coming to this for the first time, it's like, who's God? You don't know. It's not like, here is this character God, God did all these things, God is all these things, and then God created the world. Because one of the storytelling modes of the Torah is that God, like many human beings, are revealed by what they do after they are designated as special. Like, we don't know what in this book by the fact that God's about to create the world. And that means that those philosophers who say, Jewish theologians like Maimonides basically, who can't begin to understand what God is, are supported by the idea that God is never explained, really. I mean, there are a couple times where God speaks about God's self as having certain attributes, but after all, we can't possibly understand what God is, so to start off explaining God would be silly. The way I tell the students at Sinai Akiva is, when you're 13 years old, right? Could you, when you were 2 years old, imagine a 13-year-old? And the answer is no. Not only that, but you can't even imagine what you can't imagine when you're 2, right? You can't say, I'm a 2-year-old, and what I don't know about being 13 is this and this. No, you have no idea what a 13 is. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the distance between us and God is infinitely greater than between a 2-year-old and a 13-year-old. So when people tell you God is like this or God is like that, the truth is they have no idea what they're talking about. How could they, right? They can say the Jewish tradition teaches us that God wants this, that's okay. But that God is like something makes no sense. I can talk more about that, but let's get back to the text. So, God creates the world in 7 days, and any of you who have ever seen Inherit the Wind, and if you haven't, I hope you will. I always like to bring up that most fantastic movie. That's the movie that depicts the Scopes monkey trial, where this teacher was brought up in the South on charges for teaching evolution. William Jennings Bryan is a character in that, and Clarence Darrow. We'll know that a day could be longer than a day. We don't know what a day is. I will say this, though, to anticipate what we get to later. I remember when I was a kid in yeshiva, and we came to these vast age spans, like Methuselah, who lives over 900 years. And we questioned our rabbi, and he said, listen, we don't know what year necessarily means. It could be 960 years, but years might not be the same. The problem, of course, with that is if years are shorter, then how come days in creation are longer, right? If days are millions of years in creation that it took to make this or this or this, then why is it that when Methuselah comes along, all of a sudden years have been shrunken down into weeks? If you didn't follow that fine, all that means is, despite the attempts of some very fine minds, like Charles Schroeder, who's stuck here, says to fit the creation story in the Bible to the creation story in science, I think that it's a game for interesting intellectual play, but among other things, as soon as the science changes, then they reinterpret the biblical story, right? So no, we didn't do this. Actually, now that we know it's this many years, or it's in this sequence. So I would say that the story in the Torah is actually not designed as a scientific story. It's designed as a story to teach us about the order of creation and the fact that God did it and the fact that all creation is under God's superintendence, and maybe many lessons along the way, especially about the creation of human beings. Now, there are two creation stories of human beings in the Torah. They're you pass them by very quickly if you don't notice it, but one is the famous rib story, and the other is when it just says male and female God created them. So one story has a being that gets split in some way, and the other story says that God created male and female simultaneously at once. Again, I will recommend to you, as I do every year, the most beautiful traditional interpretation of this is Soloveitchik's book, A Lonely Man of Faith, which has the virtue of being a very short book. Bless you. It has a very short book, and it talks about Adam 1 and Adam 2, and why the two creation stories can be seen as teaching about two aspects of humanity. And it's also a very beautiful book, and worth reading more than once, but certainly worth reading once, but worth reading more than once. And Soloveitchik was the leading modern Orthodox philosopher and Talmudist of the 20th century. So it's also somebody who was the Lonely Man of Faith by Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, who people call the Rav. And when someone gets called the Rav, he's probably, it's like when people call the Lubavitcher Rebbe the Rebbe, they call Soloveitchik the Rav. Soloveitchik, by the way, for those of you who don't know this world at all, it is worth saying, not all Orthodox Jews are Hasidic Jews, okay? In fact, Hasidism was a reaction against the other part of the world that we would still consider Orthodox. The Rav is not Orthodox, and is not Hasidic, and the approach generally, and this is a broad generalization, and there are 1,000 exceptions, okay? But broadly speaking, the approach of the Rav and the Mitnagid and the non-Orthodox community tends to be more intellectual, analytical. The approach of the Hasidic community tends to be more emotive and dance song stories, okay? That's why, by the way, just to finish this tangent for a second, that's why the beginning of A Lonely Man of Faith is so powerful, because the Rav, who is this remote, austere, intellectual genius, starts off by saying, I have a problem, I am lonely. And you don't expect someone like that to say something like that. So if I haven't enticed you enough with that beginning, anyway, it's a great book. Okay, so God creates human beings. He puts them in the Garden of Eden, says you can do anything you want except this. 5 minutes later, of course, they do that. And it's kind of a setup, a little bit. It's like if I said to you, listen, when you leave this room, you can do anything, you just don't touch the piano. Just don't touch the piano. Anything else. The chances that you will touch the piano have just increased exponentially, right? So in any case, there's a lot in the story, but one of the ways of seeing it is it's what's called in literature an etiological tale, which is a story of origins, how we got to where we got to. It explains why we live in an unredeemed world, right?
In other words, why there's pain and suffering and so on, why snakes crawl on their bellies, why women have pain in childbirth, why people have to work for a living, on and on, all those sorts of things. They're all explained by the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, which we don't have that much time to go into now because of the collapse of two parshiot into one and one class into a shortened class. But the fifth chapter is something that I just want to point out to you. Rabbi Akiva said that the most important verse in the Torah was Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, which is in Leviticus. You should love your neighbors yourself. But his compatriot Ben Azai said that the most important verse in the Torah was chapter 5, verse 1. Zeh Sefer Toldot Adam. This is the book of the generations of humanity. Why? Because it's about everyone and everything. That's his point. And God created everyone and everything, and therefore all human beings are essentially equal. They're, in a weird way, they're the same statement differently, right? It's not that they're really two different statements. One is a more broad philosophical principle, and the other is a more intimate. And those of you, several years ago, I gave a class on Rabbi Akiva and love I think it was on a slichot. But those of you who follow his trajectory in the Talmud, it makes sense that he's the one who would focus on love, because he does in his teachings in general. But what you get is, first of all, just so we won't miss the highlights, the first murder in the Torah, which unsurprisingly is between brothers. And I say that because first of all, statistically, it's true. Most murders are people that other people know well, right? Most of them are not random and distant, but also because from the very beginning, the point is that human beings have to struggle with the impulses that they have inside themselves. And Va'atatim Sholbo, which was made famous by Tim Shell by Steinbeck in East of Eden, the point is you have this struggle in you. You can win it if you want to, but you can succumb to it if you don't. So at the outset is sort of the story of human beings, which is if you succumb to your impulses, you can do terrible things. And if you overcome your impulses, you can do wonderful and beautiful things. And when I say wonderful and beautiful things, I really do mean exactly that, because it says, he was Jabal was the ancestor of those who dwelt in tents, and the name of his brother was Jubal. He was the ancestor of those who play with the lyre and the pipe. In other words, you can create music, you can create settlement, you can create civilizations. Tubal Cain forged all implements of copper and iron. You can build bridges, which, do you know Camille Paglia, the sort of very iconoclastic feminist? She said, bridges are the poetry of men. Said women, by and large, don't build bridges, but bridges are poetry of men. She said, it's not true that men don't express their aesthetic sense, but a lot of them do it in engineering. Now, it may be that this is changing, that women will do more now, but traditionally, that was the idea. It was like, how do you express this poetic sense? Not everybody sits down and writes poetry. Some people build cathedrals, or they make bridges. But it's still poetry, which I always thought was a beautiful idea. So anyway, when I say that this is all a story of origins, it's a story of origins of all the different impulses that human beings have: creative, loving, murderous, distant, all of that. It all starts, in other words, it's all implanted in all of us. One of the reasons that I always tell people it's worth studying the Torah is because everything has changed since ancient times: technology, language, land, everything except human nature. And we have not advanced one step inside ourselves over the way Tubal Cain was made. Okay, and then we get to Noah. I just want to say a word about Noah. It says that the world was corrupt and filled with lawlessness. So the Bible does depict the world as essentially unregulated in a state of nature. That is, it's not Rousseauian. You know, Rousseau said that the problem is all human beings are really wonderful and kind, and along comes civilization and it corrupts them. That's not the Jewish, at least the biblical theory. The biblical theory is, in fact, civilization comes along and civilizes you. And if you think about it, if anybody who's ever raised a child, how often do you say, I mean, children don't start off saying, oh, let me share everything, right? I'm so happy. I love that story about, I won't identify the rabbi because it's on tape, but this rabbi told me, I think he had a 3-year-old and then a newborn. And the 3-year-old was walking with a plastic hammer towards the newborns, and he said, where are you going? He said, to fix something. And he thought, you know, you see in fact, the creation of the Jewish people, the idea is we have to show what it is to train people into being better than they would otherwise be. And you know, it's still a constant struggle throughout the Torah. So there are impulses clearly, by the way, to cooperation. We know this too, and this is also right there at the beginning because they build the Tower of Babel. And you can't build the Tower of Babel unless you're able not only to speak to others, but to work together, right? But there are also all the other impulses. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, the Torah is consonant. I never thought of it this way, but I think it's true, with like the Steven Pinker idea that as people have become more and more civilized, the world has gotten less violent. Because that's true, you know, in every statistic, like in the most violent city in the world now, right? You're 1,000 times safer than you were in London 500 years ago, or any city 500 years ago. What we consider like astronomical rates of murder don't come close to what medieval people dealt with all the time. And there are many, 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 many other instances like that. World hunger has gone down, you know, productivity has gone up and so on. Granted that our weapons are more potent and that could reverse the whole trend, but the idea is the Torah teaches that civilization civilizes. That if you leave people alone, it's not like they're going to be fine. And I say this despite the fact, by the way, there's a really interesting book that I read by Rutger Bregman, I think was his last name, called Humankind, in which he argues that people are basically good. And he has a lot of really interesting stuff in there. The single most interesting, which is great and encouraging for those of you who want to think well of people, is he said, you know, we all read Lord of the Flies in high school, where these kids are marooned on an island and they all kill each other, basically, or they threaten to kill each other, or some kill each other, and they're terrible, okay? But there is a real instance of Lord of the Flies where kids were marooned on an island and they took care of each other. And you can read about it in Bregman's book, and they were eventually rescued and all came back to civilization, and they did not at all act like the people in the book, which is kind of a nice thing to think about. But nonetheless, but we're about to have elections and you will see everybody acting like Lord of the Flies, I promise. Take it from me, it's gonna be a Lord of the Flies day when the election is. So in the Torah, I mean, in some ways, the single most encouraging and beautiful thing in the Torah, if you had to pick like one verse, which sounds like it's not encouraging, but I really think it is at the very end of Bereshit, the very last verse, God gets fed up. Now, the question of how God could get fed up, why didn't God know this was going to happen? We can deal with that. That comes up every year, almost every class, and we'll talk about it. But it says, the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the men whom I created, men together with beasts, creeping things, and bird of the sky, for I regret that I made them. And so it's literally the end of the world. The end of the world. And then it says that Noah found favor with the Lord, which means one human being can save the world, literally. And that idea that the goodness of one person can reverse that much impending destruction is incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. And by the way, not only is it powerful, but it is almost literally true in the modern age, because I don't know how many of you have heard of the name Stepanov. I'm almost sure that was his name. He was a Russian nuclear scientist who got it turned out to be incorrect. I don't have to tell you. Obviously, it was incorrect. You'll know this at the beginning of the story. Message that there was an incoming American nuclear assault, and he had to decide whether to pull the trigger. And he decided after, he decided on his own, there was no time, that he wasn't going to pull the trigger, that he believed it was a mistake, and he saved the world from a nuclear war. This one guy, who, by the way, was then not honored in his own country, because he didn't follow normal procedure, even though, thank God, he didn't. But you can read about him in Wikipedia. This is not an invention. This happened like 50 years ago. I don't remember the exact year, but he saved the world. This one guy who most of us don't even know about. So it really is possible for human beings to do unbelievable, remarkable things and to change the world in ways that we could never otherwise have anticipated. And Noah does. So Noah himself, because I want to move on a little bit from Bereshit, although I have not begun to begin to do it justice, but we will move back to it, I'm sure. Noah is an interesting character because he's called Tzaddik B'Dorotav, which means righteous in his generation, which you can interpret to his credit or to his discredit. You can say, yeah, in his generation he was righteous, but everybody was a no good thing. And had he been in another generation, he would have been average. Or you can say that to be righteous in an unrighteous generation is even harder, right? When everybody around you is corrupt, it takes special strength of character to be decent. And I incline, I gotta say, to the second view, because I really think social pressure is the greatest pressure on us. And even people who say they're not like everybody else, they're just like everybody else. It's like, I don't know if you ever saw The Life of Brian, where the guy says, everybody be independent, and everybody screams, we're independent. And one guy says, I'm not independent. And he's the only one who's independent, right? Because we all, and yet we all speak the same, we all tend to dress the same, we all tend to live the same sorts of lives. It's really hard to actually be different, as opposed to theoretically be different. And so Noah is, in fact, of tremendous strength, although he has a downfall too. So what then happens, as you know, is that all the animals go onto the ark, and again, the story of Noah is very different for kids and for adults. Because when you're a kid, you build an ark and you show animals, and you don't think, except some kids occasionally do, about the fact that we're talking about the destruction of a world and all the people in it. And it's really a horrific idea. And I think part of the purpose of the Noah story, for us especially, since we have the capacity to destroy the world, is to dwell on the horror. Because it is difficult to feel the horror of war when you're not in war. It's why every country always rushes to war, right? Because it sounds great. It's heroic and it's wonderful, and of course we'll win. Right? Nobody goes into a war thinking, okay, let's fight this war because we'll lose. And the truth is that destruction is horrific and long-lasting and painful. And so the story of Noah sort of takes on a much darker cast when you're an adult than it does when you're a kid. And it's only about building an ark and showing the animals on it and how beautiful it is. And then at the end of it, God says, I will never destroy the world again. What God, of course, does not say is you will never destroy the world again, just I will never destroy the world again, right? And there is this wonderful sign of a rainbow. And a rainbow, you'll notice, is half a ring. Half a ring. In order to complete the circle, it requires us, right? So that's God's side of the promise. Our side of the promise is entirely due to us. So the characters that we have seen so far, who have made a bigger impression, not all of them, are Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the people who built the Tower of Babel, which actually I want to come back to for a second, and Noah. But none of them really have an arc of a story. We don't really get to know Adam and Eve and what they're really like. We don't get to know Noah and what he's really like. The story part, the part where this is a character I can understand, starts next week with Avram and Sarah, because we're going to follow their lives. But we don't do that so much with Noah. And the one thing I wanted to say before I get to the end of the Noah story, and then I'll stop for a minute to take any questions before we wrap up, is that the Tower of Babel part, which is at the end of the Noah story, we think of the Tower of Babel, the generation of the Tower of Babel, as bad people, because God comes down and he knocks down the tower and scatters them. The Midrash, which is rare for the Midrash usually explains why people are bad, except for our heroes. It doesn't explain why Abraham is bad, but like when someone is a bad character in the Torah, like Ishmael or Esau or whatever, or seems bad, the Midrash comes and makes them worse, right? But the Tower of Babel, the Midrash has a very sympathetic read on, because it says, like, they were terrified that there was going to be another flood. So they built the tower up, some say to hold up the sky, others say because they wanted to live in, the penthouse so that the flood wouldn't reach them. But the point is that this is a story in part about what trauma does to you. This is a post-traumatic generation, because they just saw the whole world destroyed. And now they have to figure out, how do you live in a world where things could be destroyed in an instant? And so, those of you who came from Iran, right? This is a Tower of Babel story. It's like overnight, maybe not literally overnight, but close to overnight, a world that you live in can be destroyed. That's why when people say, why didn't people leave Europe? Because overnight, yes, there were bad things, but like overnight, an entire world was destroyed. We never saw that before, ever. Right? The closest that we came before that was the Spanish Inquisition, where overnight people were forced to either convert or flee. But even then, not the same. So the other part of this is, and I want to especially emphasize this. I don't know how many of you know what Sapir is. Sapir is an online journal put out by the Maimonides Fund that I write for. So the most recent, and it's online. It's all online and not paywall or blog. The most recent article that I just came out yesterday from Sapir is Bret Stephens wrote the overall. He's the editor. Bret Stephens from the New York Times. He wrote about cancel culture. And I wrote about cancel culture in the Jewish tradition. And the reason I bring this up is not just because I happened to publish an article yesterday and I'm talking to you, so why shouldn't I mention it? But also because the whole idea of the Tower of Babel story is diversity. That diversity is good. God creates diversity. God sees all these people of one language, of one kind, and says, no, that's not the best way. The best way is if there are different cultures, and they have different specialties, and they do different things. And this, by the way, is what Jews have been screaming at the world in different languages for thousands of years, which is being different is not bad, because we were always the different ones, right? We were always the ones who weren't like everybody else. America, by the way, in that way, is unique, because this is a country where we're not the only different ones. There were Russians and Jews, there were Frenchmen and Jews, there were always Germans and Jews. We were always like the identified different ones. But there aren't Americans and Jews. Now, diversity is hard. It's not easy, but it's still better to have 100 languages than one. And it's better to have lots of different traditions than one tradition. Another reason why Jews never said the whole world has to be Jewish, because we always believed that different traditions could also contribute. I will tell you quickly, I've told this story before, but we have 5 minutes. So in 2018, I went to Dharamshala, and I was there in part because my brother was traveling there because the Dalai Lama is a faculty at Emory, my brother's at Emory, but also because I was supposed to speak to the monks about how to survive in the diaspora. How do the Jewish people survive in the diaspora? But first, my brother and his wife and I all had an audience with the Dalai Lama. So you go into his office, we sat down, first thing he says, very first thing, is he points at me and says, "What's this about the chosen people?" Okay? So I said to him, yes, Jews believe that we have a special mission in this world, but we don't believe that no one else could have a special mission. Other people can have missions too. And then, to his, wonderful man that he is, he cracks up. He starts to laugh with that wonderful laugh. He goes, "Yeah, we Tibetans think we're special too." And I thought, of course you do. Everybody, there is no people that doesn't think they're chosen. You think the Italians don't look at Michelangelo and think we're chosen, right? Of course everybody thinks they're chosen. But that's good. That's not a bad thing. As long as you don't think other people are inferior and bad, it's great to think. It's like your kids. If you have multiple children, you think they're all chosen in different ways. They all have special gifts. And that's much better than thinking, well, only one of them is any good. So it's what Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory called the dignity of difference, right? There's a dignity in difference. Okay, we have 3 minutes. So I will stop there, yes.
So there are two contrasting ideas of God that occur to me. Of course, there are many more, but two stand out to me. There's a sense in the early chapters of Genesis that God is jealous of his own supremacy, both fear of human beings reaching up to him, and also even among the hosts of undefined hosts of
Right.
So that's a very different idea than the deterministic view that God knew everything that was going to happen.
Right.
And that Adam and Eve shouldn't have been a surprise to him.
Right.
He knew it was going to happen. So
Okay, so this is, again, these are big and large questions about, does God foreknow everything, or is God more human-like? And the short answer is every possible answer has been given to this. And there are certainly both the Bible's, the rabbinic answer is that the Bible speaks in the language of human beings. You can't know how God works, so it says God regrets, but that's only because we don't understand how God works, so God is explaining it in ways we'll understand. And that takes care of the problem. It just means we're of limited mental capacity, so that's the way it is. The idea that God knows everything, has foreknowledge, is a more philosophical idea. The Bible doesn't talk very much about that. But I will give you, even though it is a problem, and I don't want to pretend it isn't, before we end, I will give you the best philosophical answer that I know. If you really want an answer from philosophy, I think this comes from Ralbag, Gersonides. He said, the future, by the way, modern physics might not agree with this, but that's separate. He said, the future is that which does not exist, right? It will come into existence, but it does not exist. To ask God to know something that doesn't exist is like asking God to know a unicorn. You can't know a unicorn because it doesn't exist. There's no limitation on God to say he can't know a unicorn because there is no unicorn, so you can't know it. There is no future, so you can't know it. God can make predictions, but God can't know the future. Now, maybe, maybe not, I don't know. All I know is that the Bible, the way the Bible speaks about God is the way Heschel talks about God. Heschel talks about God as a God of pathos, that is a God of deep feeling. And he said the God of like this omnipotent, all-knowing, he said that's the God of the philosophers. But the God of the Bible is not that. It's the distinction also that Yehuda Halevi, who was a Jewish philosopher, made. between the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So all I can tell you is that the Jewish God is a personal God. And a personal God is described as having personal characteristics, even though it is a mystery how that's so. Okay, let's do Kaddish to Rabbanan, and then I'm sorry we have to finish early today, but we'll see you, God willing, next week. V'yikadal v'yikadash shmei Rabban. V'yamad yivrak v'yitei v'yamlit ma'atei v'taychonim v'chonim chayei v'chol beit Yisrael v'adalal v'zman charid v'yivru v'yitei shmei Rabban v'barach v'dalam v'neil ma'em. Barach v'yishtabach v'yikvar v'yitmamam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei v'kudishah v'yilam v'yichol v'ychatav v'shiratav tushpatav v'yitmatav v'amiram v'yamad v'yivru v'al Yisrael v'yal Rabbanan v'yal Talmideo v'yal kol Talmidei Talmideo v'yal kol man taskim v'yal tativ v'yal pradei v'yal atar v'atar yehei lahon v'chon shlam rabba china v'tisa v'rachamim v'chayin arifim v'zonar v'bicha v'chana mikava mahuvan v'yishma v'ar v'yimru יהי שלום הרבה משמיים החיים, הטובים עלינו ויעקב ישראל, ויאמרו, יעשה שלום במרומיו וברחמיו, יעשה שלום עלינו ויעקב ישראל, ויאמרו. See you next week. Is it off? What's that?
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
I'm gonna pick up.